Hi guys, in the past I've done introductory video to the different type of constraints in MotionBuilder, including the relation constraint. And today I wanted to start a series of videos that go deeper into the relation constraint by exploring concrete examples, starting today with a space switching system. So I have this character here with a little bit of mocap playing, and on a couple layers I've animated the right hand. So the hand is going next to the thigh, then next to the head, and it attaches to the left hand. For now it's super rough, and what I want to do is an auxiliary effector so we can control the IK of that hand and parent it to these different parts of the body, the thigh, the head, the left hand, on the fly to clean up that animation. And for that we'll use a relation constraint. So in previous videos I showed kind of how I set things up by default. So usually I have a don't touch folder so an animator wouldn't, mess with the constraints in here. That's where I'll create my new relation constraint for this. And I'll call it relation right hand IK space switch. Okay. And actually, before we dive into the relation constraint, we're gonna actually create our auxiliary effector. So right click on the IK effector here and create an auxiliary effector. What I personally like to do is first renaming that object. So you can see when it's created, by default, it's parented to the reference node of your rig, which is the parent of all the controls. So here, I personally don't really like this name. I like calling it just right hand IK. We can see here the look of the IK is a cube, and the problem with that is that you can't select the IK effector underneath the red sphere, because the cube is covering it up entirely. So what you can do is in the properties, go to look and change it from cube to hard cross, for example. See, so now the cross sticks out of the sphere, so you can select it, but you can also select the sphere itself. Of course, you can always do it with the picker as well. Let's increase the size of that hard cross a little bit. And the last thing we want to do when we create an auxiliary effector, always add it to a character extension. That way, if you bake the character in full body or body part, it'll include baking the auxiliary effector. So right click here, insert character extension, or open up character, right click on your character and say create character extension. So if you do it this way, the advantage is that the player, so your character, but in my case I called it player, is directly referenced as the attached character. Whereas if you create, if you do insert character extension, there's no character, so you need to drag that character here. It doesn't refresh, but if you leave and come back, it refreshed. So for me, I'll just keep the first one. I like renaming my extensions as well, like name of the character underscore x underscore something. So right hand IK, for example. Now I want to grab my auxiliary effector and drag and drop it in here. So hold X, click and hold drag from the viewport and drop here. I'm on MotionBuilder 2022, so I apologize for the weird visual artifacts when holding X. I hope it gets solved in a future version. Okay, so we've created our character extension. The last thing we want to set on the character extension is a reference object. It's an object of the skeleton that makes sense in terms of spacing, so that if you store a pose and apply it, it applies in a space that makes sense. As an example, on the root, which is my extension for the root control, I usually set the reference object to pelvis. So here, for the right hand IK, I'm gonna select hand right. This isn't super important for our demo, it's just kind of best practices. So when I created that auxiliary effector, you notice that it kind of messed up my entire animation because the auxiliary effector is driving. In fact, we see a little bit of rotation happening, and that's because my IK effector also has a bit of IK blend rotation. So if I remove that, then the auxiliary effector is driving 100% in translation and rotation. So we don't want to start from here because we lost all the data we had on the original animation, right? If I remove the IK blend translation rotation of the auxiliary effector, I see again what's going on here on my hand, but this guy is floating there alone, completely disconnected from the wrist. So what we want to do is first create a parent constraint so we can bake the data of our IK effector onto the auxiliary effector. So insert a parent child, and I'm going to call it parent hand right hand IK bake. Okay. So the constraint object will be the auxiliary effector, and the parent will be the wrist. And I'm going to zero that constraint, so I activate it with 0 offset. You'll see this object will snap onto the wrist. Okay. Snap actually means maintain offset. It's a bad name. So we want 0 here. So that is the parent constraint, and what I want to do is be able to turn on and off that constraint with in a single place. So what I like to do is adding another constraint that I call a relation constraint that I call master relation. If you watched previous videos of how I set up my rigs, you've probably seen that before. So the master relation is just a place where I'll have objects where I can set their values so that those values turn on and off certain constraints that we will hide into the don't touch folder. So in fact, I'm going to do that with that right hand IK bake. I'm going to move it into my driven constraint under don't touch. So an animator wouldn't have to worry about it and wouldn't have to turn it on and off manually. And then I'll do the same with the right hand IK space switch. Okay, so what we want to do is have some properties to drive our system. So on the auxiliary effector, in properties, I'll go to editor, custom properties, and on here I'll add a boolean. That boolean I will code simply right hand IK. So when I say right hand IK, I mean the auxiliary effector driving the rest. I could call it aux IK, but yeah. All right. So now we see that property appearing here. The thing is, if we just drop our object, our auxiliary effector object in here as a sender, we don't see the property. Okay, it has to be animatable. In fact, so here you can make it animatable, and personally I like just locking it. So I personally never really animate my custom properties or toggle them here, because if you toggle it here, maybe on another take it doesn't, it's not toggled. So I like having the properties. I like being able to activate them in one single place, which is what the master relation is for. So here the master relation, we want it as a receiver actually, and we can see here right hand IK shows up, so I can do right click, set value, and now I can just turn that on and off, and it'll apply to all my takes. And I'm gonna lock it here. All right, and if I want to not see rotation, scaling, translation, I can just do hide unconnected, so just have a little single small node here. Okay, so the master relation is where the animator will be able to toggle certain options while working, but we want that properties to drive stuff, and we're going to do that in the relation right hand IK space switch. So here we're grabbing our auxiliary effector again, dropping it, this time as a sender. Okay, so the setting that we choose here is gonna have an effect here. Okay. Don't know why I changed my right hand IK. Oh yeah, there's a little name conflict here between the name of the object and the name of the option, so it added a space 1. I'm not fond of this. I'll just rename it right hand IK. Okay, right hand auxiliary IK. Okay. Can I refresh this? Didn't refresh. Let me just re-add it. Sender. That's weird. Doesn't want to acknowledge my renaming. I don't know why. Okay. So when this is true, the IK mode is true, we want the parent bake constraint to be off, because when this is true, we mean that the auxiliary effector should drive, and that means it shouldn't be constrained to the wrist anymore. So we're gonna use and put that parent-child constraint into our relation constraint, and we want to drive the weight of that constraint, because the active option is not animatable at all. You can see here next to the active there's no A icon, whereas there is one next to weight. So make that animatable. Then drag and drop your parent constraint to the relation constraint as a receiver. And now we see the weight is available for us to control. So if this is true, we want the parent constraint to be at 0%. So for that, we're just going to use a if condition. If this is true, then 0%. If condition, then A else B. If it's false, we want it to be at 100%, because constraints work with a percentage. Okay. So we can see by default, if I move my wrist, the effector is following. But if it's true, the effector is not driven by the wrist. But it doesn't drive either, because we need to set the IK blend translation rotation on. So let's also make this animatable. And here we want to call again our right hand IK as a receiver this time. So we can also drive the IK blend translation rotation automatically with that single boolean turning on and off. And this time it's the opposite. If IK mode is true, we want this to be at 100% and otherwise 0. So we can use that same node and invert the numbers. Or we can use a multiplier. So in number, we can do multiply, because that boolean is true or false, but it actually corresponds to a number. If it's true, it's 1. If it's false, it's 0. So multiplying that value by 100% will give us either 0 or 100. Yeah, we can do it like this. So two solutions here. So just for the sake of using different nodes, I'll keep this one. And you can see when the option is on, when it's on, the auxiliary effector drives, because the IK blend translation rotation is true and it's not constrained to the wrist. If it's false, the wrist drives. Okay, so we have a switch. Now, the next step is going to be to actually set up the space switching, so that when the auxiliary effector is driving, we want it to be able to follow, well, nothing and be in world space, or follow the thigh, or follow the head, or follow the left hand. the secret for that is to add an actual parent to that auxiliary effector. So instead of it being directly parented to the reference, which is basically the scene origin, which you should never move, to be honest, we want to insert another object. So insert, that brings you the asset browser here, and then elements, you can choose a null, a locator. Okay, I'm gonna call it right hand IK parent. Okay, and I'm gonna make that a child of the reference. So hold X, click and drag and drop and parent. Okay, and then this one parent here. Alright, so that object is here. I'm gonna make it bigger so we see it, and then when I'm done I will hide it. So we basically want an option on the auxiliary effector in addition to the boolean to make that object either stay here at scene origin or snap onto the thigh or the head or the wrist. So I'm going to create here another custom property, and this time I'm going to choose an enum. An enum is like an integer. It's a number, full number, so no numbers after the dots. So it's not 0.5, for example, it's just 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, etc. But the advantage of the enum is instead of showing a number, 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, etc., it's showing a name. So it's much more user-friendly. So here I'm going to add that enum, and I'm going to call it right hand IK space. Okay. So the first one will be world space. So that would be the space we're in now. Second space we can put right thigh, then head, then left hand. And if you have more, you could add more to the list, of course, if you want to preset different spaces for your animators. Alright, so as always, property appears here. We just want to make it animatable and then lock it. And then here in the master relation, it appears, and we want to set the value here. Now we can hide all the other connectors. And you can see the list of the options we created here. So in my space switch, I see the option as well here, right hand IK space. And now I can set up the space switch. So the space switch will drive the transform of that object. So we want to have it here as a receiver. We're going to control its rotation and translation. And we want the different objects that we're interested in. So when we'll be in world space, there's no parent, so we don't add a particular object to this. I mean, we could add the reference if we want. Why not? We want the right thigh. Honestly, it doesn't matter as much whether you choose the IK effector or the FK effector. It's kind of the same at the end of the day. So sender, the head, and the left hand. So the key here for the space switching is to have a sum. So in vector, you can use a sum 10 vectors here. So that node allows you to accumulate like an addition of several vectors up to 10. Here we only have 4 spaces, so it's more than enough. If you were to have more than 10, you could have them in series like this. Okay, so you add 10 more. But just one is enough for us today. And what we are going to do is plug those translations here. I'm voluntarily missing one step here. That's just to explain the principle. So you see here we have the translation. I can do right click, show all values. And oh, it's outputting 0 because this is not plugged anywhere. So if I do this here, you can see my IK parent just bumped up because it accumulates the transform of all these nodes. So on the y-axis vertically, I have 96 plus 148 plus 104, so 1 meter plus 1 meter 50 plus 1 meter, so I'm like at 2 meters 50 or something, or 3 meters 50 rather. And then, so that's why it explodes my IK. The idea is that we're going to add an extra step here. We're going to add a scale. So scale is to multiply a vector by a single number. I'm going to plug that here. I need one node per object. So vector, vector, vector. Okay, and then replace the output here. So plug and disconnect, right click, disconnect. So now you can see it's back at 0 because it just takes the output of the first one, or in fact it takes no output because all those vectors are scaled at 0. So just to explain the principle, I'm going to right click here and set values. So right now everything outputs 0, 0, 0 because all those vectors are scaled to 0. So yeah, because that first one is 0, it's kind of the same here. So if I do 1, no difference, okay? But if I set this one back to 0 and I set this one to 1, see here now my object, my parent, snapped to the thigh, to the right thigh, because this vector is multiplied by 1, but all the others are multiplied by 0. So the number here is the actual translation of that object, minus 13, 96, minus 5, same number here, and same numbers here, okay? So the idea is to have only one active at a time, like this. See here, it's the head driving. Okay, so either one or the other. And of course, we don't want to set that manually by typing the number every time. We want a single number to drive that, and that's going to be our anim. So here, I'm simply going to do another kind of little Boolean condition. So back to the number category, I'm going to select is identical. So if I choose is identical, and I set the value of number B, I'm going to plug my anim to number A. Well, the order doesn't really matter here. So remember, the anim is a number, okay? If I do show all values, here it's 0, because in my master relation, it's weld, it's the first object in the list, and we always start with 0. If I select right thigh, okay, it's item number 1. Okay, weld is 0, thigh is 1, head is 2, left hand is 3. So in the relation constraint, now the numbers that I see in the anim should be 1. Okay, it always outputs 0, see if the end of your flow is not plugged anywhere. So I'm just going to plug that here, okay, and now I see the refreshed value. So in my master relation, I'm my right thigh, so that's number 1, therefore here it shows number 1. And that means here, reference, okay, we are questioning, is it identical to 0? The answer is no. So the weight of this one is 0. Now if I duplicate that node and now I ask if it's equal to 1, then yes, it is equal to 1. Because it's 1 here. So it's 1, it corresponds to 1, so that means we want this guy to drive, and that means we're multiplying its vector scale by 1. That means that's the number that gets output. Okay, without this. So we just need to duplicate that 2 more times. Up. So 0, 1, 2, 3. Okay, and you would expand that list if you want more spaces. Up, plug that in the scale every time for each object respectively. And now we have a proper switch. So yeah, basically if I switch here, up, it snaps to the different places. So that's much more convenient for the animator. You just have to change this. Now we're only driving the translation of the right-hand IK parent. So when we snap to an object, it doesn't follow the rotation, just the translation. So in the space switching relation, I just need to kind of duplicate my setup here. I don't need to duplicate these nodes. I just need to duplicate the scale and the sum. But I can reuse the is identical question. Alright. So these is identical nodes are plugged twice. And here I just need to plug the rotation every time. Okay, so rotation, 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 and rotation here. I know it's not easy to see what you're doing. Wait, I think I made a mistake here. Up, this one. So what I do usually is moving the nodes to kind of see where the cables are leading to. Okay, this one. Oh, I unplugged the translation accidentally. Should go here, translation. Right, so this one rotation, this one rotation, this one rotation. That one should be rotation here. And then translation, 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 translation. Okay. You have to have good young eyes, I suppose. Alright, so this is basically the space switching for the rotation, and this is for the translation. So just need to plug that there. And now the rotation is also affected on the parent. So our space switching is done. I can clean things up by hiding the unconnected pieces. You see that I've omitted the scaling because this is a somewhat realistic rig, let's say, so I'm not concerned about scaling. But if you wanted to add scaling, you would just have to duplicate this one more time and plug the scale in the input and the scale, the output into the scale. Pretty simple. And here we can hide what we don't need. That way, if I come back to this rig and I need to update it, I'm not like it's easier to kind of read and decipher what I did, let's say 6 months ago or something. So pretty convenient. Oh, one thing I forgot to do on the right hand IK is toggling the visibility. So I like to only see the object here when the right hand IK is on. If it's false, I like not seeing it. So here I'm just going to say if this is active, then control the visibility of that object, which is not accessible here. So remember, visibility animatable, it pops up here. Now you can plug it directly because it's a boolean, so boolean into boolean. Hide unconnected. Alright. Now if it's off, we don't see the auxiliary effector, but we can always grab it here. Now I'm just going to explain the workflow of how you animate with this. So by default you start, it's in world space, the parent is here. And the auxiliary effector is following the actual animation, let's say the mocap or the keyframe animation you've imported, because the IK mode is off, and that means our wrist effector is driving, but not the auxiliary effector. And let's say we want to clean up the first part of the animation where the hand is getting close to the thigh. We want to remove that kind of drifting and clipping. Maybe I should start with this. There's no animation because when we created the auxiliary effector, it didn't got any data. It just got spawned and got the translation rotation coordinates of where the wrist was when we created it. So it's not animated. So first thing you want to do is bake this. So now you see this data is the animation of the wrist in world space because it's relative to the parent being here. So it's actually the same data that we would see on the wrist itself, the wrist effector. So it's in world space, more or less. So if I activate the right hand IK and I change the spacing while the right hand, the auxiliary effector is driving, it pops up because it's offsetting this animation that we have here by this amount, you know, like the delta between the world origin, which is our current space, and the thigh when we switch. So what we want to do is switch with the IK not driving. So we're hiding the switch, okay? It's kind of making it more seamless. So if you have your animation baked like this, you want to change the spacing. Okay, so now the parent is here. Now you want to bake again. So you want to convert that data from world space into thigh space, if you will. So bake plot in selection mode. Now you can see that data is in thigh space. So for example, when the hand comes here close to the thigh, it's kind of stabilizing, because more or less it's close to the thigh, this entire portion, right? So we just need to clean those curves. So now if I activate my IK mode, I see no difference because I just baked before doing this. But now my auxiliary effector is in the space of the thigh. So I can clean up the keys, maybe by duplicating the base layer, putting it into override. Okay, I'm gonna quickly select, you know, edit my keys a bit, keep a key where I like the posing of the hand, delete the keys where it's drifting, and copying that key, making sure the curves are flat in that case. And now I have, like, you know, for this little portion of time, I have the hand following the thigh nicely. Okay, so I can bake that onto, I can bake in full body, or I can just bake, yeah, I want to bake the arm. So I want to kind of save that new motion that we have on the arm. Okay, so bake the arm in body part, deactivate the IK. So now the data that we've edited is baked, and now we can change the spacing again, just so we work on the part where it's constrained to the head. Okay, so I was here attached to the thigh, and now I'm attached to the head. And I'm going to do the same process again. So now that I'm in head, bake the auxiliary effector, I activate the auxiliary effector mode, I clean up the keys when it's next to the head, okay. So I'm doing it simple, just duplicating a bunch of keys, but I could also reanimate it and do whatever I need to do. Okay, in this case I'm just maintaining the same pose, so I'm just keeping the curves flat. Okay, so make sure when you do that to not have any IK blend rotation translation on the wrist itself, just on the auxiliary effector. Okay, now that I'm done, I'm going to bake the arm again. And I think you get the idea now. I'm going to deactivate that, go to the wrist mode, further, bake the data. So the wrist is ready to be activated. And now I'll do this one more time. And now there's a bit more cleanup to be done, I think. So I can show kind of like this. Alright, so see here, maybe I've deleted too many keys. I don't have a good base anymore. So what I can do is turn off the weight of that layer. So I go back to what I had in the base layer that I baked. So I have a safe save here, if you will. And I can just key on my layer that's deactivated, or not deactivated, but like turned off. I wait it out rather, and key a couple keys, and then reactivate it, and then work from there. So I can really fine tune that transition and make it seamless. And of course here, just for the demo, I'm just playing around with the wrist, but when I do this, I would also work on the fingers at the same time. Okay, for example, here the left hand is getting a little too close to the chest, so I would rearrange that. Maybe select the auxiliary effector and one of the fingers and do rotate around to adjust a little bit that flow. Or maybe I would on the layer play around with the left hand to accommodate a little bit. Go back to 0 before, go back to 0. Okay, so I'm just massaging a bit what the left hand is doing, so it accommodates for the motion of the right hand, like with those couple keys here. But I made sure I had 0 keys before and after that portion that I'm editing, just to make sure I'm not messing up what was before and what is after. Okay, so here on that key, it's a 0 key on the left arm, so it doesn't do anything, whereas here I have a little offset. Okay, and I can keep editing my auxiliary effector on the layer here. Right. Okay, making sure the keys are somewhat flat, and so on. So you can see I haven't messed up the previous part of the animation. I just cleaned up what I had to clean up, so I can maybe bake in full body at that point and remove all my layers, and you know, my animation is done. I mean, of course for the demo it was super rough, no finger animation, but we did what we wanted to do. We cleaned up things, and now I can just deactivate that mode and go back to world space. And because I deactivate this, I know I'm not messing up other takes that I may have in my scene. So this is pretty useful, you know. Basically when I work this way, I'm keeping in mind that my default setting is to have the wrist effector control and not the auxiliary effector. The auxiliary effector is just a temporary object to clean things up in the correct spacing thanks to our list. So I hope this was a useful demo, and have fun with your rigs. Cheers. Thanks for watching.